welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I go through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First letter. If not for her and him, 17th of July 2014. Brian Gregg says in his letter, Why Thought Matters, 16th of the 7th, that we live in a world of assumed heterosexuality. From this, the reader can only assume that the world is not heterosexual. If this is the case, could Mr. Gregg explain how the world goes around without heterosexuality? Ian Crawford, Cottesloe. So you've misunderstood what he was saying, and possibly deliberately so. And so to explain why you're wrong, the world is obviously not heterosexual. The world, in whichever way you mean that, is not even a sexual being. The Earth does not reproduce sexually or asexually, nor does the entirety of existence, nor does the society that we live in. People are heterosexual or homosexual, and Brian Gregg was absolutely right when he says that the society in which we live, or the world if you would, generally assumes people to be heterosexual unless proven otherwise. That is, heterosexuality is the default position, and anything other than that is seen as some kind of deviation from that. What he was pointing out in his letter is that when a celebrity comes out as being gay, it normalises the idea of homosexuality. So it chips away a little bit at the idea of assumed heterosexuality. Now, you might say, well, most people are heterosexual, and therefore it is reasonable to assume that, any given person is heterosexual until proven otherwise. And to a certain extent that is true, but it is probably better if we don't assume one way or the other. Somebody's sexuality is rarely of any importance at all, and so J random person or celebrity X or whatever, we have no reason to assume, we have no need to assume that they're heterosexual or homosexual, unless that is a case in point. Now, if we do actually meet somebody and their sexuality happens to be important, or relevant to the topic at hand, then yes, it would be reasonable to tentatively say, well, they're probably heterosexual because that is the majority position. But that is different than this idea of assumed heterosexuality. So assumed heterosexuality means that whenever you open a book and you read, you will assume that all the characters are heterosexual until proven otherwise. Why? Just because. And we can compare this to the similar idea that feminists say we're arguing against for the last several decades, that generally when somebody talks about a doctor, doctor such and such, is that we generally assume that that person is male. Now, back in the day, you might argue that, well, the majority of doctors were male, and so that was a reasonable assumption. But the thing is, we still do that now, even when the gender balance is much more reasonably, close to equal. And part of addressing this idea is to undermine this idea of assumed heterosexuality. So part of what happens to allow people to feel comfortable to come out is to send them the message that homosexuality is not deviant or abnormal. It may be a minority position, so it might be unusual perhaps, but it is not a deviation, and that's what attacking this idea of assumed heterosexuality means. So I hope that clears it up for you, Ian Crawford, who I know you're not even watching this video. And I suspect that you probably understood what it meant anyway. But if you didn't, there you go. Never on Sunday, 17th of July 2014. I wonder how it can be that the same offence committed on a Sunday morning on a long weekend attracts twice the demerit points as when committed the next Tuesday morning in the same place. When one can lose one's driving licence as a result, surely an arbitrary attribution of demerit points sometimes defies common sense. Shouldn't there be a principle in law whereby like offences attract like penalties? Richard Charlesworth, Nedland. So what he's talking about here is, here and in many places, we have a system whereby if you commit a traffic offence, you get fined, but you also generally attract demerit points. If you accumulate too many demerit points, you lose your licence. This prevents people who can, afford to pay fines from simply driving, any which way they like. So a little while back, maybe somewhere in 5 to 10 years ago, it was noticed that on the long weekends, and when we had public holidays on the Monday or the Friday, there was a significant spike in the number of road accidents and road accident deaths in particular. And this was partially because there was a spike in people. A lot of people go away for the long weekend here. That's what we do, and we're a bit of a car culture because of the way that the geography of our state is. So there are a lot more people on the road, a lot more people travelling longer distances and driving in unfamiliar circumstances, and as a result we had a higher number of road deaths. So in an effort to do something about that, the idea was that we would levy double demerit points during these long weekends. So during the long weekend period, and it's highly publicised, everybody knows about it, there's no surprise, that if you are caught for doing some kind of traffic offence, speeding say, you will get double the demerit points that you otherwise would have. And so it's much easier to lose your licence for infringements during this long weekend period. And so what this writer, the person who's written this letter, is saying is that surely this doesn't make much sense. If I'm speeding down a particular street and it happens to be on the Sunday morning of a long weekend, I will get double the demerit points than if it happens to be the Tuesday afterwards. And shouldn't like offences have like penalties? So what he's missing is that this is a simplistic analysis, is that driving on that Sunday morning is not the same as driving on the Tuesday morning. The whole point of the double demerit thing is that point in time, over that long weekend, we determined that driving was statistically more dangerous, and therefore when you speed during a long weekend, you are actually committing an act that is more dangerous than speeding on a non-long weekend for the same act in the same place. Now, whether or not you could argue that it should be applied across the board, or whether it should be country roads or above a certain speed, whatever, is beside the point. Well, at least it's beyond this discussion. But as a basic principle, it is actually a different situation to speed during a long weekend than it is to speed not during a long weekend, because it was determined that that was a much more dangerous time period. So the question is, yes, whether that is sufficiently different to justify having the demerit points. The results have been very good, actually. Lots of people, so a significant amount of our road toll, which, the number of people dying on our roads is colloquially known as the road toll here, and the figures are brought up regularly in the newspapers and TV news, and a significant chunk of the road deaths occurred during these long weekends, and that number of deaths has been steadily decreasing, partly as a result, it's claimed, of these double demerit campaigns. And I know I, for one, drive more carefully during those times than I otherwise would, because I know that a particularly egregious mistake can make me lose my entire licence in one go. So I also try, drive more carefully, because I tend to, on those times, if I'm going away, I will be driving at speed on roads I'm unfamiliar with, and generally of lower quality because they're in the country rather than a metropolitan area. And so I'd say anecdotally, and there is some supporting evidence in terms of the road toll going down, that it has actually worked. And so I don't see it as being a bad policy. But I'd be open to argumentation if somebody could be bothered to actually make any. An Unspoilt Child, 18th of July 2014. Thank you, Andrew Brand, for providing the cream to the pro-argument on corporal punishment. 2 fingers to caning, letters 17th of the 7th. You confirm the point that the discipline you received in 1966 is still working nearly 50 years later. Can you also recall how many timeouts you had? Detentions? Lines you had to write? No. Gosh, I wonder why. Jack Jones, Hillary's. So what the letter writer is talking about here is a person called Andrew... Let's back up a bit. So there has recently been some education expert whose expertise, I'm not sure, was really that well established, has recently advocated the return of the cane. The cane was banned from all public schools in Western Australia, I think in about 1995, and even before then was rarely ever used, and could only be used with parental consent. So basically, the cane has not been a part of our education system in any major way for more than 20 years now. Apart from, apparently, in 2 private... So, that was the public education system. The private education system has still is allowed to use it, and there are 2 schools in the whole of Western Australia who use the cane, and they are both private Christian schools, and they both have student numbers in approximately 30 for the entire school each. So, about 60 kids. Total. Who knew? Christians. So, recently an expert has advocated bringing back the cane, so to be able to use corporal punishment. This guy, Andrew Brand, wrote in a letter saying that he, in 1966, received a caning by his headmaster in which he had 2 broken fingers, and that he was concerned that bringing back the cane could result in such things for his grandchildren. So what the letter writer here is saying is, well, you can obviously remember having your fingers broken, so the punishment must have been working. The problem is, so the problem is that simply remembering the punishment doesn't mean that the punishment is working. By that logic, we should ramp up the punishment to be as severe as possible, because then it will be truly memorable. And if people remember it for the entirety of their life, they will obviously, that's the punishment working. Unfortunately for that argument, the actual purpose of the caning was to correct or prevent poor behaviour. And all of the evidence has shown that it didn't. It simply didn't. And in the small amount of curbing or correcting of behaviour that you did get in some circumstances was hardly commensurate to the amount of harm that it caused to the child. So we know that caning caused harm. It's well documented. People don't want to hear it. People who are pro-caning don't want to hear it, but we know that it caused psychological harm for those children. And many people will testify to that. We also know that it didn't correct behaviour, because generally the people getting caned were caned lots and lots of times. A single caning generally didn't prevent them from misbehaving in the future. And the fact that, that it was particularly memorable. Now, other people wrote in to say things like, well, I was caned and I turned out okay, which is the survivorship bias. That is, the people who turned out okay after being caned are the ones who are most likely to write in. Those people who didn't turn out okay may not even be able to read a newspaper because they failed in their educational system. This was brought home to me particularly when I worked in a prison, and I would have a room full of men, because that's who I worked with, who had done despicable things, generally violent things. We had armed robbers, we had rapists, we had murderers. I'm talking about people who've done really despicable things, and we'd always ask them about their upbringing and their childhood. And to a man, every single one of them would affirm how fantastic their parents were and how good a job they'd done raising them. And overwhelmingly, they would say things like, look, I was whipped by my father with a belt, and I turned out fine. So we would have people who were literally in jail for the rest of their life for murdering people, saying that they turned out fine. So the fact that you can find people who think that caning didn't affect them, and you can find people who maybe it didn't affect them, doesn't mean that it wasn't a harm to them. And in fact, all the evidence shows otherwise. And the fact that these punishments were memorable hardly means that they were effective. Just Stop the Boats, 18th of July 2014. I didn't vote to have the carbon tax removed. I voted to stop the tsunami of illegal boat arrivals. The minute I walk out the front door, I feel like I'm in some Middle Eastern country and not Australia. Dorothy Smith, North Perth. So firstly, Ms. Smith, the people that you see the moment you walk out your front door that make you feel like you're in a Middle Eastern country, they are not illegal boat arrivals. That's because there essentially are no illegal immigrants. So the boat arrival might be illegal, but the people on them, if they ended up living in Australia, then they were found to be refugees who needed protection and were given it. And so no stopping of illegal boat arrivals would have prevented refugees from coming to this country. Secondly, the actual numbers of people arriving by boat here are tiny. And so the people that you encounter who make you feel like you're living in the Middle East, these people are not refugees who came here on boats. They may be refugees, but overwhelmingly the vast majority of people that you're seeing are, one, not refugees. Of the ones who are refugees, they didn't come here, but they are legitimate and would have gotten in anyway. And thirdly, even if they're legitimate refugees, they almost certainly didn't come by boat, because the vast majority of our refugees don't come by boat. And lastly, Ms. Smith, if your only objection is they happen to be of Middle Eastern appearance, then I'm sorry, but that's just racist. If you don't like living in a society where people don't look white, then you've got a major problem. Our society here is very multicultural. And even if it wasn't multicultural, it is very multi-ethnic. There are lots of people here who are not white. whatever their culture happens to be, they may be well within the mainstream of Australian culture, but they're still going to look like they're from some Middle Eastern country, or from Southeast Asia, or from East Asia, or from Africa. This is a large part of the population here in Australia. And if you don't like that, I'm sorry. One, it's too late to keep them out, and two, reasonable people have, long ago come to the conclusion that what somebody looks like is hardly the most important thing about them. Lastly for this week, show the evidence, 22nd of July 2014. Patricia McAuliffe, caution on fracking, letters 21st to the 7th. Wars against fracking because of the danger of water contamination. Can she, or anyone else, provide any evidence of any water contamination anywhere in the world which is the result of fracking? Or is this another case of mass hysteria? Terry Walker, Warwick. Good question. And I was actually curious to know whether there was any good evidence, so I went looking, unlike you, who just wrote into the newspaper. And it turns out that actually it's quite interesting. So fracking, for those who don't know, is when you take some kind of a well or some kind of mine, and you pump liquid into it at high pressure to force out the gas. It's a way of getting more fuel out of an oil well. And you force the liquid into it, the water generally, under very high pressure, and that fractures the rock around it, releasing this gas. And the fracturing is why it's called fracking. Now, there is concern that in doing so, some of the chemicals that are in the water that you're using under high pressure may leach into the rock and get into the local water supply and cause water contamination. And the question is this an issue? So when I went looking, I found out several things. Firstly, that is one of a number of environmental issues. That is not the only one. And so, yes, maybe Patricia McAuliffe, I didn't actually read the letter, was saying that this is an issue, and even if she were wrong on that, there would be a lot of other good reasons for being very cautious about fracking. Secondly, what is the actual situation? Does it cause? So, interestingly, the US is basically the only country in the world that's had sort of allowed fracking with widespread abandon. And so almost all of the research focuses on the US perspective, because that's where all of the, almost all of the fracking is going on, basically. And interestingly, the results have found that essentially the concerns that contaminated water with chemicals in it would get through the fractures and into the groundwater in local aquifers basically has never been documented to occur, and probably hasn't occurred. The reason for this is that in the US, what they're fracking, the vast majority of their fracking is in shale gas, and shale gas occurs at a very low depth. Essentially, the shale gas, where the fracking is happening, is so much further beneath the water table that there is no way that it could contaminate the water table. The water table is orders of magnitude closer to the surface. There has been a number of incidents of water contamination, though. This is caused by, and these are the other concerns, things like the actual, basically, whenever you do mining, there is a risk of contamination. And whenever you have a country like the US that has pretty weak environmental protection clauses, or they're poorly enforced, you get lots of things like the wastewater just being, getting into the ground supply after it's come out of the well, or being forced down into the well at high pressure and breaking across out of the well at a low depth, not where it's fracking, but actually just out of the well into another, into the water supply, because the casing isn't as strong as it should be, or other things like this. So this is not the fracking exactly causing that, but certainly the more mining you allow in areas where there is groundwater, and the less controlled it is, the more likely you are to have these accidents, regardless of the actual kind of mining that's going on. But yes, not directly attributable to fracking. Now, the other fly in the ointment here, though, is that the shale gas fracking that is the majority of what's going on in the US, and which is the one that the basis for us concluding that fracking probably doesn't cause local groundwater contamination, is not the kind of fracking that's generally going to be happening in Australia. So the kind of fracking that they want to do here is on different geological formations, and these ones are much more likely to be close to the water table. So as a result, there is a lot of caution. We just don't know. It is the reasons why we can be so sure that it almost certainly hasn't happened in the US, don't apply in the Australian context, or actually in a lot of other countries. And so for one, I mean, fracking has been shown to we know that it causes earthquakes. And at the moment, fairly small earthquakes, although magnitude 4 does sound a bit bigger than I would have thought, and a whole host of other environmental issues. So there's a lot of other issues, that happen that we could argue against it on the basis of. And secondly, the kind of factors at play which would, have prevented groundwater contamination in the US, almost certainly aren't at play for much of the fracking that is, people want to do in Australia. And so on that basis, I would say that actually there is legitimate concern over groundwater contamination. So there you go, Terry Walker. Turns out if you don't just write into the newspaper, you do some research, you can actually find out some things. Anyway, that's it for this week. I feel better having had that rant. Hope you're all doing well. See you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.